Howdy my totally always tubular gamers, we're back with another video, and today I got an interesting topic for you. You ever play a game and it just has a stellar intro or an amazing first few hours and you're like, man, this shit is hype, this shit is peak, and then it slowly fizzles out and by the end of the game it just kind of goes out with a whimper, or at the very least it's nowhere near as exciting as that introduction. As you play more and more of the game, it just kind of declines in quality, and by the time you're done with it, you're like, yeah, that was a good game, but man, the first half of that game was incredible. Like, the introduction was so great, the prologue was really great, the first few hours it just had an amazing gameplay loop, but it really just teetered out by the end. Or maybe the story was just nowhere near as compelling or exciting in the second half of the game. Well, that's what we're going to be talking about for today's video. We're going to be talking about the games that peak early. When I mean peak, I mean that they're hyped, that they're really great, that they're at the top of their game, they're at the highest quality, where the story or the gameplay or the moments are the best that they're going to be for the entire game. They're, peak. Hopefully I've described what peak is to you. And with that, I'm going to be talking about 10 games that, in my opinion, do peak early. They're better in their first half or introduction than the second half. They really are at the highest quality in the first 50% of the game versus the second half. And I'm not saying any of these games are bad. Far from it. There's actually some really great games on here. Some of my favorite games ever are actually on here. But even I can't deny that the first 50% of these games are better than the other 50%. Not every game can be like Half-Life 2, where it just has this amazing consistent quality throughout the entire experience. Sometimes the first half, it really is just better. I'm also giving a warning right here. I will be talking about spoilers for these games. I usually don't spoil anything about games, but with this kind of video, yeah, I kind of have to. So if a game pops up that you don't want to be spoiled on, just skip to the next section. Apologies in advance. But this intro has gone on long enough, so let me know down below about some games that you think peak early, where they're at their most hype or the best in the first few hours or first half of the game. I'd love to know some examples that you all think of. These are just 10 games that came to mind for me. Maybe I'll do a part 2 in the future. We'll see. Please like, share, comment, subscribe. I got the Patreon and the super thanks. Any support is truly greatly appreciated. So let's get to those 10 games. So the first game I'm talking about today is Resident Evil Village. Now, RE8 was really the game that kind of sparked this entire idea. I was talking about it with a friend of mine and he said, yeah, I think the first few hours are pretty awesome, but after that, not so much. And I went, you know what? RE8 is a perfect example of a game that totally peaks early. The first few hours of Village are actually immensely enjoyable. There's a great hook, the gameplay's awesome, and it's really intriguing. You get dragged to the village after Chris steals your baby, you get jumped and nearly killed by lichens, you meet all of the antagonists, and then you go to the first real area of the game where you face off against Lady D and all of her vampires, and I really think this is easily the best part of the entire game. It's really intriguing from a story perspective. You want to learn about the lichens, why Chris did what he did, and you want to learn all about these villains. And then you're facing off against Lady D, who's not only easily the most iconic part of this entire game, but I think she has the best area in terms of level design, structure, and of course being memorable. This is easily the most memorable part of the game. When you think of Resident Evil 8, the first thing you probably think of is the first part of the game. You don't think about the second half when you go up against the other villains, or when you play as Chris, or when you go to some of the other areas. And I'm not trying to say that the other areas are terrible and that the game's not worth playing after you beat Lady D, but I just think the game has a bit of a drop in quality. And I really think by the end of it, yeah, it kind of fizzles out a little bit. There is a pretty powerful ending to this game, and a pretty good plot twist at the end, but I really just think the game is never able to capture that magic, that atmosphere, and intrigue that those first few hours possess. I would say that the first few hours genuinely are some of the best hours of any Resident Evil game, but I think after you beat Lady D, the game goes from being just like amazing and great to good, which overall leads to a pretty good experience. I know a lot of people have compared RE8's intro to RE4's, and while you can make all the comparisons you want, I think RE4 is able to have a very consistent level of quality throughout the entire experience. You could probably say that a bunch of Resident Evil games peak in the first few hours. Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil 3, etc, etc, but for today's video I'm just talking about Resident Evil 8. I think those first few hours, some of the best survival horror hours legit of like any game from the last 10 years. And then after that, it's good, sometimes pretty good, but it doesn't hit the same. But hey, this isn't just an issue for new games, older games have had it as well, and here we have Far Cry 1. I haven't talked about Far Cry 1 in a very long time. I love the original Far Cry, it's one of my favorite shooters from the 2000s. but I will be the first to admit that the first half of the game is much better than the second half. When you start the game, you're dropped onto this island that looked very good for the 2000s, and you're really taking on just this small army of people. But what's great is, like, every encounter really is a sandbox. There's plenty of different ways that you can approach this. You can be kinda stealthy, you can run in guns blazing, and even when you do that, there's several different ways you can just totally wreck everyone's day. And the AI is actually decently smart in this game, and they'll react accordingly. There's also plenty of awesome set pieces, and it's really fun to just explore the island and take on all of these people. The game really is a fantastic shooter when this is happening. The game really takes advantage of the jungle setting, and the AI is incredibly dynamic. There's a lot of great firefights you'll get into. But then in the second half, especially the last third, the game kind of just drops all of that. You go to these much more man-made environments, military bases, and a lot of corridors. You can't really be stealthy here. The AI is nowhere near as dynamic. The set pieces aren't as good. And then they introduce these creatures, and fighting these creatures, yeah, it's just not all that great. You can't be stealthy with them. They don't have dynamic AI. They literally just rush you and try to melee attack you as fast as possible, and they're real bullet sponges. Fighting these guys, it's just never really been all that fun. Outside of when I first played through the game, every time I've played Far Cry, once I get to like the last third or so, I usually just stop playing the game since I don't enjoy it anywhere near as much. I love the beginning part where you really are hunting people in the jungle, and 20 years later, this is still peak Far Cry. Like, the gunplay's really great, and while all of the other Far Crys obviously offer a lot more and non-linear experiences, man, the first half of the original game still is really great. Obviously, I very much recommend the original Far Cry, just know that the last part of the game, it ain't so great. So here we have Final Fantasy 15. I think this is another great example of a game that peaks really early. The first half, like first 60% of Final Fantasy 15, in my opinion, it is fantastic. You're dropped into just this massive open world. You can drive around in the car. There's tons of hunts and side missions. You can cook a bunch of crazy things and cup of noodles. In the story, it's actually really intriguing and interesting. There's a lot of world building, and you're learning about Noctis and his boys. And I know plenty of people that put 20-30 hours into the first half of this game, the big open world, but once you get past like the 55-60% mark, the game drastically changes. It becomes like a totally different game. It becomes incredibly linear. Noctis isn't cool with his boys. There's almost no side content, and the story, along with the pacing, really just come to a screeching halt. It feels so different from the first half, and it's nowhere near as good as the first half of this game. Seriously, the quality difference is massive. I know plenty of people that think 15 is a bad game because they hate the second half of this game so much. And while I don't think the second half is all terrible, there are a few good moments, and the last hour or so of this game is actually pretty great. It's still full of issues, and I know that Square tried to address it throughout the years. They added some extra side content, they let you play as the other guys, but it's still crazy to me just how lopsided this whole game feels. This might be the most extreme example of a game that peaks early. The first half of the game is just fantastic, and I seriously loved almost every minute of it. There was so much variety. The combat encounters all felt fresh and interesting. The side content was really great. The world building was excellent, and I really was becoming a fan of Noctis and his boys. And then in the second half, like, it just totally falls apart. The combat gets stale, you get sick of the characters, the story's not going anywhere, that awesome open world you got to explore with all the side content, it's just completely absent, and what you have instead is just basically corridors moving forward, which isn't a bad thing on its own, but in this case, I think it absolutely is. It plays to this game's weaknesses more than anything else, and for anybody that's played Final Fantasy 15, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about here, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's plenty of people who have gone back, replayed the game, or maybe even their first time playing through it, they just stop playing the game once you leave the open world, and I totally couldn't blame them. The first half is peak. And so here we have Halo 1. Now I know this is gonna ruffle a few feathers, but before you unsubscribe, just hear me out for a minute or two. I think Halo 1 is still a certified classic. I think it still is a great first-person shooter, and it was a legendary landmark title for Microsoft and console gaming in general. However, I think if you go back and play through Halo 1, especially nowadays, you'll probably see that Halo 1, it really does peak in the first half. And this isn't to say that the second half of Halo 1 is all bad. No, there's actually some good levels in the second half, particularly the last level of Halo 1 is pretty awesome also. But I think if you compare how many amazing levels there are in the first half of Halo 1 to the second half of the game, you'll see that the game is much better in the first half. That first mission when you land down on Halo and the next 2 or 3 missions, these are all great levels. Like, they're fantastic levels with excellent level design, big open areas, the AIs really put on full display here. It's incredibly smart, the gunplay's great. Like, these are very enjoyable levels. But then the Flood shows up and things just kind of take a nosedive. Fighting the Flood is nowhere near as enjoyable as the other enemies. The level design, in my opinion, just kind of falls off a cliff, especially when the library shows up. It's just kind of generic copy-pasted rooms all over the place, and it doesn't really pick back up until like the very end of the game. And I'm not trying to say the second half of the game is awful or terrible or should be skipped or anything like that. I just think there's a very clear distinction in quality when it comes to the first few levels and really the second half of the game. And if you're gonna get all mad at me and say I don't know what I'm talking about, my response is, what are your favorite levels of Halo 1? Is it Halo? Is it Truth of Reconciliation? Maybe the Silent Cartographer? Or the Assault on the Control Room? What's your least favorite levels? The Library, 343 Guilty Spark, 2 Betrayals, Keys? You see what I'm trying to say here? The game's still good, the multiplayer's still goated, and Blood Gulch is still a legendary map. It's just overall Halo 1, I think it peaks early. Well, if that didn't piss you off, maybe this one will. Here we have BioShock 1. Now, BioShock 1 is one of my favorite video games of all time. I think it is a fantastic game, and it really is a master class when it comes to first-person shooters. But, like, big butt out here, big, juicy, fat, round butt, I think BioShock peaks a little early. I think the first 66% of the game is way better than that last third of the game. I'll just go into major spoilers here. Once you kill Andrew Ryan and you have the big twist of Would You Kindly, I think the game just kind of takes a rather large dip in quality, not only from a narrative and world perspective, but also from a gameplay perspective. When you start the game, it's really intriguing, the atmosphere is really great, you're trying to figure out what happened to this world and what it's all about. You learn about Andrew Ryan. He seems like this really great guy, but something obviously went very, very wrong, so you're trying to figure out what exactly happened. There's some really good characters that show up here, and I think the gameplay is really good, constantly introducing new areas and environments. You're getting new plasmids, and the enemies, they actually go down pretty easily. Then the game really reaches its climax when you confront Andrew Ryan, you learn about Would You Kindly, and just that entire sequence. It's all really great stuff, one of the best plot twists of any video game, but after that, yeah, it just kind of meanders towards the end. The vibe and atmosphere and intrigue is kind of gone since Andrew Ryan isn't here anymore. I don't think Atlas or Fontaine is anywhere near as interesting as an antagonist. And then when it actually comes to the moment-to-moment gameplay, I just don't think it's as enjoyable either. The enemies become very, and I mean very, bullet spongy. I feel like the level design and the set pieces are just not as strong, and the final boss just kind of sucks in the original BioShock. And so, with all of this, I have no problem saying that BioShock peaks early. The second half, it's still good. It still is BioShock's gameplay and world, which is still fantastic, and I think the game is still excellent. I'm not trying to discredit BioShock as a whole here. I just think once Andrew Ryan's gone, the game is just not as enjoyable as it once was. Again, it's still one of my favorite games of all time, but I just thought it was worth bringing up for a video like this. So here we got an interesting one. We have Devil May Cry 4. Some people might be scratching their head on this one, but if you've played through this game, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. When you start the game, you aren't Dante, you actually play as Nero, and while I know he's not everybody's favorite, he actually does have a decent amount of depth and plays pretty differently from Dante. You're actually going after Dante, and the game sees you go through 10 pretty awesome levels. You do some just fantastic boss fights, there's some really great encounters in the level design, yeah, it actually is pretty decent, and then you finish the 10th mission and then they finally let you play as Dante, and once you play as him, you realize that you just have like an ocean of depth when it comes to the combat. You can switch between all of the styles, he has a bunch of different weapons, he's nothing short of awesome. The problem is, Dante doesn't actually have any levels made for him. You play through the first 10 missions backwards, complete with the boss fights and everything, and yeah, Dante feels very different from Nero, but these levels play out basically exactly the same, and the story doesn't really progress here either. You're just playing through the same levels again as Dante. And it's just kind of like, what happened here? Like, Dante is the better character to play as, and again, there is just a stupid amount of depth when it comes to the combat, but the levels play out basically exactly the same. And so with all of this, I think it's one of those examples where the first half of the game is way better than the second half, and it's not because Dante's gameplay isn't enjoyable, it's that when you play through the first half of the game, all of these levels are new, all of them are fresh, all of these boss fights are new, they're a real spectacle, especially when you do some of the crazy shit as Nero. And then having to repeat it all in reverse, it feels not only lazy, but it's just not as enjoyable to go through these levels. I still think Devil May Cry 4 is a pretty good game. The combat absolutely carries this game as far as it does. If the combat was not as good as it is, I would certainly be on it more, since they essentially only created 50% of the game and then just have you do it all over again. Like, this is just blatant padding and low-key seems unfinished. But hey, the combat is pretty fun, and we would get Devil May Cry 5 from this, which has completely new levels. Every single level is new and fresh, and that game is fantastic. But Devil May Cry 4, it's still a good game. It's just always bothered me that you have to replay all these levels. Like, why? Why did they do this? So here we have another more modern example, and it's Fallout 4. Now, I really do love Fallout 4. It's one of my favorite RPGs from that era. I love it warts and all. But I will quickly concede and say that the first half of Fallout 4 is way better than the second half. When you start the game, you actually get to see the bombs drop, and then you're given just this amazing narrative hook about your child being stolen from you, and you gotta figure out just what even this apocalyptic wasteland is all about, and you're exploring around everywhere, meeting plenty of new people, and really just trying to piece everything together. The first half, it's awesome. It's really great stuff when it comes to the story and narrative, and it's even pretty decent into the second half as well. But then the game does its big twist, which I'm gonna just spoil here. They reveal that the kid was actually taken many years ago and he's a full-blown adult, and you can side with the Institute or not, and I never really liked this twist, and I don't like anything really that happens after here. After this, the game becomes a bit more linear, and the choices seem to matter less and less. Yes, they actually do make you choose a faction, but while the factions felt very different from each other in the first half, here they all feel incredibly similar, and at times it barely even feels like it matters which faction you went with. At the end of the day, you still blow up the Institute, or you join the Institute and help them out, and I think all of the endings just fall totally flat, and I think the narrative just really falls off. That really amazing, compelling hook and world building that's in the first half, it's really just not there in the second half, especially the late game. I will say though, when it comes to Fallout 4 peaking early, I really am just talking about the story and some of the choices. When it comes to the moment-to-moment gameplay, I think it's really great all throughout. I think the companions are excellent, the sense of exploration is really great, and I think the progression, at least when it comes to building your character up, is also very good. And so I would still recommend that somebody plays through the entire game. It's just that later half, yeah, the story, it just kind of falls apart, doesn't it? And I'm sure there will be people who will say, you could say this about Starfield, and my response is, yeah, but Starfield doesn't start out anywhere near as strong as Fallout 4 does. Fallout 4 just has an incredible intro and first few hours from a narrative perspective, and it just isn't able to maintain that throughout the entire experience. It's still great and I love it, but it very much is a game that peaks early narratively to me. So here's a game that doesn't get talked about a bunch. It's the Prince of Persia reboot that came out in 2008. While I think this is a good game, it absolutely is one of those games that just kind of dips in quality the more and more you play of it. From a presentation standpoint, this game actually still looks fantastic, and I think the gameplay is good. It is a bit simple, especially compared to the other Prince of Persia games, and no, you can't actually die, but that doesn't really bother me. What really bothers me is just how repetitive this game gets. When you start the game, you're like, oh, I'm doing some pretty cool parkouring. This guy's got some moves, you get to do some combat, and while it is rather basic, it's still somewhat enjoyable. You're collecting these like light orbs and you're exploring around these areas, but then you realize the more and more you play of it, that's all this game is. It's just simple parkouring and platforming, collecting these light orbs and usually getting to a spot on the map so then you can fight a really easy boss. The more you play of it, the more stale the gameplay becomes. If this game was like 5 or 6 hours, I really wouldn't have even had an issue with it, but this game is almost double that. And it feels like it just keeps going and going and going, and the narrative certainly isn't going anywhere either. And so I think the first half of the game, it's enjoyable, it's fun, It feels incredibly fresh, you're just admiring the pretty graphics and the cool parkouring, and you're pretty alright with the gameplay in general, but then it just becomes stale, it becomes a slog, it gets repetitive, it even starts to feel like a chore by the end of it. And yeah, there might be a set piece or two or story moment towards the end of the game, but I really don't think the game is anywhere near as enjoyable once you get past the halfway mark. I wanted some variety, I wanted something new, and this game, it doesn't have any of that. It's pretty repetitive, and by the end of it, I was just kind of ready for it to be over, and that's never a good sign. I still think it is a good game, but yeah, it's certainly got some pacing issues. And so here we have a very similar situation with Sonic Heroes. Now, I love Sonic Heroes, it is one of my favorite 3D Sonic games, but man, does this game get repetitive and stale. You play through Sonic Heroes the first time as Team Sonic, and it's a very enjoyable experience. You're enjoying switching between the 3 different characters, you're enjoying the levels and the environments, the pacing's really awesome, and it's just a very enjoyable time, assuming you're playing as Team Sonic. And then after you beat it, you realize that there's 3 other teams to play through the game as, and you're like, oh, okay, they probably all got different levels or different orders. No, you realize they all go through the same levels in the same order, and there's only a few things changed. You play as Team Dark, and you get to go through the same levels as Team Sonic, but they're now even longer and more drawn out, which kind of messes with the pacing of the entire game. Okay, that's not great. Then you play as Team Rose, and the levels are actually shorter, but you're still going through the same levels. And then you play through the game as Team Chaotix, where you've got to explore around these levels for collectibles. And this, by the time I got to Team Chaotix, I was just sick of these levels. I was sick of the game, and I didn't want to collect any of this shit, and you really got to comb some of these levels for all these collectibles. The game just gets incredibly repetitive since you're playing through the same levels over and over. I think the ideal way to play through Sonic Heroes is to play through the game once as Team Sonic and call it a day. The other teams just aren't as enjoyable, and I think the more you play this game, the less and less you're going to like it, especially some of Team Dark's levels. Like, these levels feel like they just go on way too long, and then Team Chaotix, man, the less of them, the better. And I don't hate the characters, I don't hate any of the characters, I just don't like that you have to play through the exact same levels over and over, and then if you want to get all the Chaos Emeralds, getting the Chaos Emeralds is just terrible in this game. The special stages are just awful, and the final boss, while it is cool, and it has some really great music, I just don't think it's worth it. I think it's best to really just play through the game once, and then move on to the next Sonic game or something else, because the more times you end up going through Seaside Hill or the awful Haunted Mansion level, the more you realize that Team Sonic's playthrough, that initial playthrough you did of the game, really was peak Sonic Heroes. And everything else just kind of pales in comparison. Of course, you could play as one of the other teams first, but I mean, it's called Sonic Heroes. You're really going to play as one of the other teams before Team Sonic? I certainly didn't. And the story I gave was my personal experience with this game, and I imagine it's probably most people's experience with it. So to finish things up, we have Metal Gear Solid 5. I've talked about this game plenty of times on the channel. I think it's a pretty great game, and it has some really excellent gameplay, maybe the best gameplay of the entire series. But this is absolutely one of those games that is better earlier rather than later. It peaks towards the beginning of the game. This game has a really strong, awesome intro, and then you really get to build the base out and do some really excellent missions. And all of these missions really are great. Each one of them is like a sandbox where you can approach really every mission in a few different ways. The map is pretty awesome. You go to a second map and the game sees all well and good, but then you get to like the second half of the game, and that's pretty much where all of the problems arise. You realize very quickly that you actually have to basically replay a bunch of the missions from earlier in the game, just with new conditions or slightly different win conditions. But even with that, it doesn't feel like these missions are all that different from before. The story also goes on a serious pause, and basically very little happens until the end. And even then, there's just a straight up unresolved plot line. The story, yeah, it just kind of falls apart towards the end of the game, which for a Metal Gear game is kind of like a cardinal sin. Like, don't get it twisted, the core gameplay is still good. It's still MGS5's gameplay. It's missions we've already basically done. The story's pretty much not even there. And ultimately, it just feels like filler or padding content. And by the time the game ends, it doesn't go out with this big bang like most Metal Gear games go out with. It kind of goes out with a bit of a wet fart. And yeah, we all know this isn't exactly how Kojima and his studio wanted the game to end, and it wasn't with his vision, but that's a different topic for a different day. What I'm looking at is what we have, not what we could have had, and what we have here is a game that has a fantastic first half and a less than stellar second half that equals still a pretty good game that I would have no trouble recommending, but it certainly feels like it is missed potential in several areas. Alright, that's it for today's video. Hopefully I didn't upset too many people, but if I did, you let me know down below. But as always, if you're going to comment anything, you can comment the code word. Today we're going with a classic. We're going with bricks, because hopefully you're not going to throw those through my window after I included Halo, BioShock, and Metal Gear Solid 5. Anyway, hope you all have a wonderful day. Stay safe, y'all. Bye-bye.